Hello everyone, this is Nick. How are you all going? It's time to dive back into this How to Play X-Wing series. Apologies for that large break, people, but unfortunately I had to change my living situation, which meant there was about a 6-month gap between this video and the last one. But nevertheless, we persevere and we will continue on by talking about how to set up a game in X-Wing. Now, if you are completely new to the game, I recommend that you check out the last couple of videos I made on this as we spoke about list building. And some of the things that I covered in that video, we will be referring back to in this one. So if you're completely new, it's not going to be entirely clear what I'm talking about if you haven't watched that previous video. So click the annotation up here if you haven't already watched that. And just before we continue on, what I am referring to mainly pertains to the first player token. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, the player who has the lowest total points cost in their squad gets to choose who is the first player. And some of the reasonings behind taking a cheaper squad is explained in that previous video that I just mentioned. Now, as we're setting up a game of X-Wing, we have what is the only absolute guaranteed simultaneous effect in the game. If you happen to have no ships on your squad that match the initiative of your opponent's ships, indeed, placing the obstacles at the start of the game might be the only time where the first player token matters. So no matter what, you do have to do this step. But before we talk about placing obstacles, let's just talk about the game mat in general. X-Wing is played on a 3-foot by 3-foot mat. You'll have to find some kind of table to play this on. I strongly recommend against playing X-Wing on the ground. Apart from anything, it really hurts your back. And some of these models can be a bit fragile, and you do run the risk of stepping on them if they are at ground level. If you're like me, you're probably going to want a table that's nice and high up. For example, this one I use here stands just over a meter and is very useful for those of you who may have back issues. Nevertheless, any standard dining room table is fantastic. Most of them have at least 1 meter of depth and will more than accommodate the mat that you need to play X-Wing on. The mat looks like this, and it commonly depicts a star field, although there are many different ones with different depictions of planets and such from the Star Wars universe. You can also buy a lot of aftermarket mats with different artwork on it. Just make sure it is the correct size of 3-foot by 3-foot. With the mat on the table, both you and your opponent place your squads on either side of that mat, with all the cards and tokens and everything, which I mentioned in the last video. Also, each player will require a damage deck, as well as a set of dice, maneuver templates, and range ruler. Now, every player is required to bring all of these things to each tournament. If there's ever any concern about the sizing of a ruler or a maneuver template or anything like that, you are allowed to request to use your opponent's. FFG do make some of these as prize support, and you can buy some of these aftermarket, so there isn't strictly the best of quality control over the size of these. Indeed, at the time of recording this video, there has been a bit of recent controversy with some of the official FFG prizes being a little bit out of size. So if you see your opponent using these, you can always request to use them. That is completely within the rules. As well as all this, you and your opponent will be required to bring 3 obstacles each. Now, if you're just playing a casual game, yeah, you can use any 6 obstacles. You can just bring them all yourself, or your opponent can, or whatever. But when you go to an official tournament, you are required to bring 3 different obstacles that you use within that entire tournament. So between you and your opponent, you will always have 6 of these. Now, if you take a look at the image here, you can see the 3 different types of obstacles you can bring for this purpose that are currently available in the game. These are asteroids, debris clouds, and gas clouds. Now, there is a strong possibility that yes, FFG will bring out different kinds of these in the future, but at the time of recording this video, this is what's available. Now, don't confuse these with some of the objects that can be dropped in the game, like these bombs or mines or cargo chute tokens. The way to tell these apart is they have these little notches, because these are designed to be placed on maneuver templates when dropped from a ship. We'll explain how these work later on in our video on movement, but for the time being, just make sure you only have these if you have the corresponding upgrade card to go with them. And if there's ever any confusion as to whether these are obstacles that you place at the start of the game as opposed to drop as an upgrade card, Information on all of this can be found in the rules reference, which can be downloaded separately from the FFG X-Wing website. Now, in terms of why you might choose to use these obstacles, there is actually a lot of theory behind it. In general, if you're flying larger base ships, you generally don't have the best maneuverability. As such, you want to take obstacles that don't hamper that too much, and you might favour things like smaller rocks or debris clouds to avoid that. If you're using a list with very high maneuverability ships, as in aces like Fang Fighters and TIE Interceptors and the like, you may favour the larger rocks, because although these do hamper your movement, the fact of the matter is, because the rock will be placed on the table, it hampers your opponent just as much as it hampers you. So if you have ships with better maneuverability, you are more equipped to deal with the problem of having larger rocks in your way. If you have, for example, stress mechanics in your ship, say you have a pilot like a Sarge Ventress, you could take debris clouds to further the stress control plan. And if you have aces with a low amount of health but a high amount of green dice, you might want to consider gas clouds, as they offer better defense when you're defending through them. Now, we're not going to talk about all the different mechanics pertaining to these rocks in this video. There will be a lot of that to cover in the videos on movement and the attack phase. For the time being, that's just a little bit of light strategy for those of you who are trying to think about what kind of obstacles we will be taking. Now we come to place the obstacles on the board. The player with the first player token places the first one down. This can be any of yours or your opponent's obstacles. Remember, you don't only have to place your own obstacles on the board. This cannot be placed between range 0 and 2 of the board edge. As previously mentioned, this represents anything within this distance of the range ruler. So if you are placing it anywhere near the edge, be sure to measure it as you're placing it down. The player without the first player token then takes another obstacle, again either theirs or their opponent's, and places it anywhere on the table, again nowhere within range 0 to 2 of the board edge, but as well as not being within range 0 to 1 of another obstacle. No obstacle can be placed within range 0 to 1 of each other during this part of the setup. The players then alternate, continuing this process until all obstacles are placed on the board. And just a quick discussion about the first player. I mentioned in the previous video when we were talking about who you might want to give the first player token to. That was a discussion about high initiative ships being wanting to fly last. There isn't really considered to be a strong strategy around giving a player the first player token based on who gets to place the first rock. It's generally considered more advantageous to make sure the aces get to fly last, or certain blockers get to fly first in some situations. Being able to place the first rock is considered advantageous, but not more so than the order of the ships flying. However, it is worth pointing out that if there is no other simultaneous game effects, as in both you and your opponent's squads do not have any clashes of initiatives, say your opponent has 2 initiative 6 ships while you have 4 initiative 2s, then this is not even a consideration, and if you have the choice, you may as well take the first player token so you get to place the first obstacle. This isn't strictly better than giving your opponent the first player token, as you still get to place the last obstacle in that instance, and that gives you a lot of control over the obstacles on the board, regardless of not placing the first one, but it's generally considered in practice that placing the first obstacle is the most potent thing you can do in this situation. Once all the obstacles are placed on the table, the players then proceed to place their ship on their table edge, within range 0 to 1, or within the distance of this first notch on the range ruler. And this is done one by one in order of initiative. The ship with the lowest initiative is placed first, and then you make your way up through the various initiatives until all the ships are placed on the table. If both one player and their opponent have a ship of the same initiative, then the player with the first player token must place their ship first. If 2 or more ships of the same initiative are owned by the same player, that player gets to choose what order they are placed in. Now, some ships also start in reserves, and this is very, very important. Some ships can be docked, like this Phantom or the Nashtar Pup. And because they can be docked, the player who is fielding them has the options of starting them in reserves. In other words, when they come to deploy, the player can then place that ship on their pilot card, and they can deploy through certain circumstances later in the game. In the instance of the Nushtar Pup, you deploy it after the Houndstooth is destroyed. In the instance of the Phantom, you get to choose when it is deployed. There is no requirement over this. And that is pretty much it when it comes to the setup. After this, you would start the rounds and go through the various phases, which we'll cover in later videos. But for the time being, let's have a bit of a discussion about the strategy behind some of this. Bear in mind also, there are some pilot and upgrade cards that interact with the board state as you set up the game. Now on the screen here in front of you, you can see all of those cards that are currently legal at the time of recording this video, but doubtless more of these will come along as more waves are released in X-Wing. Now none of these are really all that confusing to read. If you take a look at the top paragraph of their text, they usually explain at which part of the setup their ability activates. But be aware, if it just says setup and then talks about some kind of thing triggering, this happens after all the ships are placed on the table. Be aware that you do need to be very careful of some of these. For example, Director Krennic, setup. Before placing forces, assign the optimized prototype condition to another friendly ship. This must be done before any ship is placed on the table, and if you accidentally forget about this, you will lose the ability to activate this. Despite the fact that it is non-optional, if you accidentally wait for some of the ships to be on the table, you would be gaining an unfair advantage through the information that would supply you, and therefore you have legally missed your window to take advantage of that. This must be placed before any ships are placed on the table, so your opponent has a chance to counter the placement of the ships and the optimized prototype condition card. There are some cards that allow you to alter the nature in which you place a ship, such as Han Solo on the Resistance. He does not need to be placed within range 0 to 1 of the board edge on the player's side. He can be placed anywhere on the table as long as he is beyond range 3 of any enemy ship, as in the full length of the range ruler. This allows you to execute some really fun mind games with your opponent, and can also allow Han to headhunt aces. Very fun pilot to fly. We also have Boba Fett as a crew option on the Scum faction. He places your ship in reserve when it deploys, but after every other ship is set up, he deploys the ship onto an obstacle. Now don't stress, as long as your front guides are not overlapping that obstacle, you are not going to suffer the effects from that obstacle. That's just how they work. As long as you're flying directly off at the next turn, there's no problem. But again, this allows you to play some mind games with your opponent, also allowing your deployment to counter an enemy's deployment after all ships on the table have been placed. Can be quite powerful. Also be aware that as you're placing your upgrades on the table, some of them do stipulate that they must have a certain side face up, like Chancellor Palpatine or L337. This is because these cards in particular represent some kind of transformation which can only occur in one certain direction. For example, once Chancellor Palpatine has revealed that he's Darth Sidious, he can't really go back into hiding. That is kind of silly. Also, before we wrap this video up, I do want to quickly talk about some of the kind of deployments you might want to have with your ships. Now, I mentioned previously what kind of obstacles you might want to take with certain lists, and that does also pertain to the way obstacles are placed. Again, if you want to make the board difficult because you have more maneuverable ships, you might try to place them closer together, making them more difficult to fly around. But in terms of the way you place your ships on the table, you do also have to think about the difficulty that your ships will have reaching your opponents. You have to think about the nature in which your ships are going to meet with your opponents. Do you want to try and fly around the back of them and flank them? Do you want to try and meet them head on with a joust? And this is really important when thinking about the way you deploy your ships, because you want to make sure whatever game strategy you decide to employ is doable and, if possible, difficult for your opponent to counter. We'll cover more of this topic in a later video, as again there is a lot of theory to talk about here. But for the meantime, as you're choosing your obstacles, placing your obstacles and placing your ships, be mindful of all of these things. And as you start to learn to play X-Wing and you have a go at a few games, be mindful of the repercussions of your actions. Did that certain placement benefit you, or did you get wrecked by your rock placement because you couldn't execute your game strategy? This is something to be very aware of as you're learning the game, and something that is also deceptively very important. Anyway, everyone, I hope you found this video entertaining and or informative. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and comment and share it with people that might find this interesting. A lot of you might follow my channel because you're already heavily invested to X-Wing, but my goal here is to get the best resource for teaching people how to play X-Wing on YouTube. So if you know any new players, please share these videos with them and we will continue to make these as best we can. In the meantime, you can also like my Facebook page, follow me on Twitter and Reddit, and please also consider supporting the Patreon. This is the real thing that is really driving this channel forward. It is literally keeping the lights on, and I cannot thank the existing patrons enough for what you have done for me up to this point. I will catch you guys in the next video.